Hey, Lindsay, good to see you again.
Good to see you.
Yeah, so today we're going to be covering narcissism, which is a very trendy topic, actually. It's all over the internet. Yeah,
I would say is I think that's really why we sort of thought about it would be helpful to do have a conversation around it.
yeah. And largely, I think having a conversation about it because it feels like for me in my work, working with couples and in conflict situations, that anyone we don't agree with or is behaving in a way that we don't understand or can fathom is probably a narcissist. I hear this all the time, and we see all the time on the internet all these little sound bites, little TikToks, little YouTube clips, how to identify a narcissist. And everybody's like, yes, my ex was a narcissist. This other one was a narcissist. And it
Mhm.
just seems to be narcissists everywhere.
I mean, I think there's a real appetite for making sense of difficult experiences, difficult relationships. And I think something like this has that sense, I don't know if you find this, of really pathologizing or locating the problem in the other person. Now, that's
Mhm.
not to say that people might not be behaving in ways that are harmful or unacceptable. But I guess if you say, well, my ex is a narcissist, it puts us in a place of I wasn't in the wrong. They were the narcissists. And so I think as human beings, we crave certainty. We want to make sense of situations. And where things have been hurtful, painful, or difficult, it almost feels like our brain wants to make sense of that. And then we get given these sound bites of, if your partner has done this, this, or this, then they're a narcissist. It almost it reduces things down to this really simplified definition that our brain just goes pop. Oh, that's the answer. That's what
Mm.
that was about. So I think that whilst I can really appreciate how we take comfort in that sort of soundbite making sense of things, at the same time, it really doesn't do justice to the more diagnostic or clinical understanding of what we mean by narcissistic personality disorder.
Actually really rare to be diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder. I mean, studies show it's between at absolute maximum in certain populations up to 6%, but on average it's 1% of the population. So that if you kind of take that and extrapolate a little bit in the relationships that we've all been in, is it true that 99% of every ex I've ever had has been a narcissist? I just think some of that stuff can be oversimplified. And
Yeah.
in my work, I often see people are thinking there's a narcissistic dynamic, but actually something else is going on. And relationship dynamics are really complicated. You can have people that have different attachment patterns that can
Yeah.
show up as having narcissistic personality disorder, but actually there are just some traits that a lack of compassion or a lack of empathy, or perhaps they isolate when they're under stress, or they do strange things that seem narcissistic, or they defend themselves in a way that appears narcissistic, but that doesn't always mean that it's NPD.
And I don't think we are wired as human beings to automatically look first at what our contribution is to the development of an interaction or a pattern of responding in a relationship. So it might be that someone is responding in certain ways that could be labeled as narcissistic like behaviors, but we're not sure what we're bringing to the mix, or we haven't perhaps thought in the same way because I don't know about you, but I wander around in my own skin. I've always had the brain that I've had, and what is automatic and often subconscious reactions to me, I don't necessarily become as aware of how they might land for others. And I use
Mm.
myself as an example because I think that's just being a human being. We are often unaware of what it is that we're doing that might activate a response in some way. I was interested, you talked a bit about different attachment styles or ways of relating. And I think that we only know the way we have of relating, perhaps unless you work in this field and you get to see lots of different types of relationships and patterns of interacting. But what is just our go-to way of responding might actually be quite different from how else someone responds to closeness or intimacy or conflict. So our go-to way of coping with something might actually activate a response that we find quite difficult or quite
Mm.
painful. Again, that's not to take away from the fact that there are some behaviors that we're not excusing or taking away, but I think there's something about how can we give ourselves the gift of accountability where possible, because actually the more we can think about what is it that I'm doing, where is my role in this, not that I'm causing it, but it's systemic. So thinking about how two people coming together, there will be a reaction and then another reaction and then another reaction, and round we go. So making sense of that can often be a real opportunity to think about if we want to change a pattern or change relationships going forward. That can be a really helpful
Definitely.
insight.
Definitely. And I think if we consider that communication is that response that we get,
Mhm.
it is this cycle. It's, an empowering way to look at it is, what am I putting into the mix? What have I not understood or sought to understand that is contributing to the cycle that could be feeling like a
Mhm.
narcissistic pattern? I mean, gaslighting, for example, you know, you see all over the internet, if somebody gaslights you, they're a narcissist. Gaslighting is not just the domain of narcissism. Gaslighting can be when we're under attack, we need to defend, or we're struggling, we're under pressure, and in that pressure response, that could be the way that we respond to that trigger in that way. So I think if we just consider, instead of pathologizing things and trying to have a label, which excuses us from looking at how we might be contributing to the cycle, actually seeing maybe this is something that is showing up in our dynamic. And what am I doing? And what is this other person doing? And how do this interactions create this dynamic that
Mm.
we're actually feeling and experiencing?
I often like to think of it as what is happening in the relational space between
Mhm.
two people. Because then I'm also really careful that we're not saying, if you've been in a relationship where you've experienced some harmful or damaging or painful behavior, that we're saying that, well, that's your fault. What are you bringing to the mix? It's not that either. It's understanding that you've got two individuals and something is happening in that relational space between the two, where
Mm.
one person's reaction is reinforcing a reaction, and around we go. And I think that's a really empowering place to be able to think about, well, where can I learn from that? And it might be things about our own behavior. It might be things about setting boundaries. It might be things about choosing our partners, what we look for, what works for us, what doesn't. And that can take a whole range of things. But I think that there is something actually quite freeing in moving away from pathologizing or placing full blame in the other person in a
And that,
relationship. And I
and
don't
that,
just mean romantic relationships.
no,
This can happen in any context, can't it?
definitely. And I think, there's something to be said for, you know, it's empowering to look at, what do I bring to a situation, regardless of whether the situation was super complex and toxic and there was behaviors from the other person that is just unacceptable.
Mm,
Because, I'm in every relationship that doesn't work out. I happen to be there. And if I take a look at, well, what am I bringing to that tolerates it, that puts up with it, that steps over certain things, or perhaps even unconsciously trains the other person that this behavior is acceptable. If I look at, there's something I'm doing that is contributing, perhaps 1% of the
mhm.
actual picture, but I take responsibility for that and I extract myself from that pattern, then
Mm.
I'm empowering myself to go, I don't want to be part of that again. I don't
Because
want
that's
to
the only
behave.
bit we can influence.
That
That's the bit
is,
we have agency and control over. So that's the
yeah,
bit that we can create change from that start point. Um,
definitely.
I think
Yeah.
that that's, yeah,
So
not
what
easy though.
is what is narcissistic personality disorder? Like, if we say someone's a narcissist, what, from a clinical perspective, would we have to hit all the hallmarks to actually make that
Mm.
diagnosis?
So it's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, and we're on the fifth version of that, that would define what criteria would a person have to reach to hit or to reach or to be given that diagnosis. And as you say, this is not a particularly common diagnosis. So it would be thinking about certain patterns of behavior and the frequency, the length of time those patterns of behavior have been there, and that they cause a problem in the person's life. So we kind of have this dual mix of what do we see and how long has it been there and how persistent is this problem. So it might be that we would see it's a long-standing pattern of behavior. And I'm looking slightly because I want to make sure I don't forget, I don't carry around DSM criteria in my head all day long. But it's thinking about how people see themselves as more important, talented, or deserving than others. They might feel entitled to special treatment, rely heavily on praise or validation to feel okay, reacting strongly to criticism, rejection, or perceived disrespect, use or take advantage of others to meet their own needs, and struggle to form deep mutual relationships. Now, those aren't the exact technical language, but kind of an interpretation that I think is a little bit more user-friendly. So we're thinking about these, though, that they're not just one-off patterns, or if someone behaves in that way on a couple of occasions, they would attract that diagnosis. These are things that are persistent over time, developed in early adulthood, and cause real problems in their life, in their relationships, in order to reach that threshold of being given the diagnosis. So this is something that comes from a place. And I think what can be really helpful is thinking about, well, where might that come from? This isn't something we catch. It's not like a cold or flu that we just catch it. These are patterns that develop over time. But I don't know, would there be anything you would add to your understanding from the more diagnostic perspective?
I think there's been kind of discussions around that kind of both manipulative and charming kind of nature, and then quite, if you do something that I don't like, you're now my enemy. So I either want fans around me or I want enemies around me. These are two people. There aren't really more than that. And I'm going to be quite influential and charming, manipulative to try and kind of get what I want. So if there is, but the thing is if we see that collection that you've described in the DSM, and we sort of think of some other things, little sound bites that we've heard out there, there are so many other things that could explain that. There are so many other diagnoses or reasons or patterns or some kind of developmental thing that could explain this kind of behavior, which is why it is rare to diagnose somebody, because they have to have all of this over time.
There are 9 specific criteria, and you have to meet 5 of them, and it has to be met over time from early adulthood. So yeah, it's got to be a really entrenched, embedded part of, and I guess you wouldn't just be looking at traits. The clinician diagnosing that, certainly in my experience, would typically be a psychiatrist that would do diagnosis, would say it's really about understanding the organization of the person's personality. It's not just some observable traits, tick a few boxes, and then you get given a diagnosis. And it's really thought about, where does that stem from? So professionally, I prefer to, I guess the language personality disorder is very pathologizing in the first place. And I find it more helpful to think of personality disorders as personality adaptations. So thinking about whatever context, whatever situation you grew up in. So your primary caregivers, how attuned were they to you emotionally? Were your needs met emotionally and otherwise? How did you learn, were people trustworthy? Could you show vulnerability? All of those ways in which we build an internal working model of ourselves, of the world, of other people, develop early on. Now, if in your world you have to adapt how you behave in order to feel safe, feel secure, feel loved, and have your needs met, you then repeat those patterns, I guess, as anyone would. When we start reaching narcissistic personality, I think, NPD is a shorthand. When we start hitting those thresholds, that's when those coping responses have moved into a space where they're really rigid and embedded in a person's life, such that that's how they then interact in most relational spheres in their life.
And what would be that tipping point where somebody would want to get diagnosed? Like, what's it like for them?
What's it like to walk around this world?
being a
yeah.
narcissist, you know, having that sense, like, what's it like for you? I mean, my experience in you know, again, in a limited way, working with true narcissists, is they're very empty. It's a horrible experience for them. Like, that's kind of a sense of, you know, I don't feel any empathy, but I hate that I don't feel any empathy. There's something really wrong with me. They worry about it sometimes. And there's this sense of um emptiness and sadness at the core, you know. So I'm curious, what's it like for somebody to be a narcissist, and what would be that threshold that would make them seek diagnosis?
I guess it's hard to truly imagine what it is like, and I'm just trying to, I guess, tease or pull from my experience of conversations that I've had with people. But I think the world feels a very lonely place, because if you
Mm,
think about the way that, you know, when other people talk about what it is like to be in connection, in relationship with someone with NPD or with a narcissistic personality disorder, um, how can a person feel true closeness, true intimacy, where it doesn't feel safe to allow yourself to be vulnerable, to open up, to have to wear such tight armor just to protect
mm,
your sense of self? And I guess it feels almost like you have to hold on so tightly to that, because how scary it must be to feel like, well, if I don't have this, what
mm,
will happen? That sense of just how things might come crashing down, or that sort of that sense of what if I just crumble, and how scary it can feel. And we all do things to protect ourselves from the emotional things that we find scary. We will all do that to different degrees. And I guess it's how hard that might be if that is your go-to experience of yourself and of relationships and other people. You touched on
mm,
something actually about empathy, and
mm,
I think we could understand people who've attracted a diagnosis of NPD. They can experience cognitive empathy, so they can understand
mm,
intellectually that something might be painful or difficult or others for others, but really struggle to feel it. So that affective component, that
mm,
real felt sense, that is often misunderstood or overlapped or interpreted in different ways with psychopathy or someone being
mm,
a psychopath, which I think is partly because of that overlap. We thought that could be
mm,
a good topic for
mm,
our next conversation.
mm,
But thinking about how there is a sense that relationships don't work out, that things don't go well, that we want them to, and a sense of sadness or shame or guilt that they
mm.
don't. This is a difficult lens through which to experience yourself and experience your life.
Definitely. And I think, you know, and to feel like, if I'm not charming, if I'm not manipulative, if I don't control the situation somehow and with my mechanisms that I use, that loss of control is like an annihilation.
Mhm.
You know, it's like death to the person. It's very, very frightening. So it it is interesting to see things from their perspective, because of course being on the receiving end of their behaviors is also awful. And there's certain people that find themselves often on the receiving end of that kind of behavior. What kind of people are on this end? You know, and how can we, if we find ourselves on this side, kind of take responsibility and see if we can have healthier dynamics? Like, what can we do better?
I think that's a real opportunity then for moving forward,
Mm,
for sure. Um, my brain's almost side jumped into thinking about what are some of the myths that are
mm,
out there. I mean, I don't know if we've touched on that a little bit already,
mm,
or just thinking about you know, my sense of walking through this world is that we would develop these ways of interacting, these ways of being with others for survival. This is about emotional safety and survival. Even though it doesn't give us the results in relationships that we might want, it helps us feel safe, because what is familiar, it feels safe. So we feel more protected. And those will have been learnt over time. But I guess I'm thinking, how does that play out with some of
mm.
the common things that we hear about online or that we see? I don't know. What have you come across?
Well, I think if someone Well, if I think the first thing is that narcissism is really common, and it's like everyone, and we should spot them. And they're out there, and there's lots of them, and they could be covert, and they could be vulnerable, and they could be grandiose, and they could be malignant, and there's all these labels, and they're all out there, and you could be working with one right now. I think, as we've said, it's quite rare for it to actually be a condition. And I think it's also quite tricky to say. I think another myth is that if I don't like you and our dynamic feels toxic or it feels
Mhm.
unpleasant and I'm not enjoying this, then that's another sort of area to go, well, then you must be a narcissist. And I think that could be another myth as well.
You mentioned earlier gaslighting,
Mm.
and I think that often that's where people, because I think that's a term that probably even 5 years ago I wasn't really hearing all that much, but now I feel like I hear it
It's
both in my
everywhere. Yeah.
professional practice in life, online. It is everywhere, and I think that when we've been on the receiving end of gaslighting behavior, often people are quick to say, well, they're gaslighting me, they're a narcissist. When I think under the right conditions, almost any of us are capable of gaslighting another human being. But it's, I think, again, stepping away from that sense of the pervasiveness and the pattern over time, really losing touch with that sort of armchair diagnosis, or diagnosing that can happen. Um, I often feel, I think you also used the word earlier, manipulation, and that's often a term that I hear in the context of people who've attracted diagnoses of personality disorders. And it's this sense of they know what they're doing. This is under their control. This is choice.
Mm.
And I think that it can be helpful to think about responses to emotional reactions as far less conscious things. So we might have patterns or ways of responding that are just paths that are so well trodden. They kind of happen really before we've had a chance to think about them.
Yeah.
I don't know if each of us were to think about how would we respond in an argument with our partner. We often may respond to similar behaviors in quite a similar, consistent way. And I guess it's
Yeah.
just if someone has learned to respond in certain ways that would attract this diagnosis, then yeah, how much can we say that's an active choice? That's not someone saying, I want to go out and do this behavior, or to interact with someone in this way. That's not to take away from the fact that it can be damaging and harmful and painful. But I think, yeah, taking away the idea that this is a proactive choice on a person's part.
I think the idea that all narcissists are very obvious, arrogant, loud, braggadocious,
Hmm.
that's not necessarily the case either. Some people, can be quite emotionally avoidant, conflict
Hmm.
phobic, traumatized, depressed, empty, isolated, alone. They've calculated that the only way they can get through something is by being manipulative or you know, doing things in a particular way that can be quite
Mm.
calculating. And that can be a defense mechanism, I like the word you used, armor, as before. And I
Hmm.
think narcissism doesn't explain everything that was wrong in a dynamic or relationship either.
That's thinking about, we haven't talked really about, can you change? Can you recover from, I mean, I guess partly as a psychologist, whilst I work alongside and have an understanding of diagnoses, we would work far more from the sense of a formulation of understanding a person's unique context and history and experiences. So we would I would, from my profession, often see a diagnostic process as a bit of a snapshot in time, and people do their very best at thinking about, with what we're seeing right here, right now, how do we make sense of that? What label? How would we describe that? But I think, as with anything, as refined as people have tried to make those processes, they're not infallible, and diagnoses do change over time. But I think even that was, I guess, a little bit of a caveat to diagnostic processes from a psychologist's perspective. But thinking about, is change possible?
I
So,
absolutely believe that. And I think And I think there's been many instances where I've had, a couple or somebody that I've worked with, a group that I've worked with where, somebody might show up as having some of those traits, but their awareness of that, the awareness of how it affects the dynamic, that there's an impact that I'm causing by the way that I'm behaving, and learning alternatives to get their needs met. Because at the core of everything as human beings, we're here to get our needs met. And we get our needs met, we have good emotions and positive emotion and affect. Don't get our needs met, we have negative emotion and affect. And our behaviors are associated in this attempt to try and correct this and get our needs met. So I think if you see it as this defense mechanism, I am being this way in an attempt to get my needs met and it has a bad outcome. How about I try this because this is more effective? This has less negative impact. This is what I can do that can still get my needs met, but it's not destroying and hurting somebody else. I think I've seen incredible transformation when people learn this and they can kind of get to a place where they think, okay, by doing this in this way, I'm actually going to get my need met. It doesn't hurt the system. This is more effective. And then I see great change. And I think it is absolutely possible for somebody with MPD to change. They just need to have that desire and impetus to find different strategies to get their needs met.
And I think a willingness to tolerate how scary it might be to resist those sort of well-trodden paths, those ways of responding that have been so familiar, that have been, armor, if you like, to try something else, because trying something totally different is really vulnerable and can be quite scary. I can see if perhaps it was a person in relationship with another, in whatever context that relationship is, working on this together, you can have quite open dialogue about, I'm going to try responding like this, what helps, what doesn't, and you can help the person learn to feel safer in trying different strategies, because another person in their system is on board and is aware of what they're changing. Because sometimes, and we might have all had those experiences where we've tried to work on something and we're changing something, but the system doesn't react how we might have expected it to. And sometimes, certainly in my own case, I think, oh, I think I overswung. The pendulum went too far the other way. So
Yeah.
that actually doesn't always create the quick wins or the really reinforcing types of responses of, yeah, this is now how I'm going to try and do it. So it takes commitment and it takes persistence to really show up and continue to be brave and continue to do things that might feel really quite scary. But I guess with the faith that it's taking you to an outcome that is something that you really do want.
And I think for a lot of people, the idea that they have agency, the idea that they can develop a competence that is new and different and find a different mechanism to get their needs met and to achieve an outcome, that can be so empowering. That's the whole feeling of learning is healing is a learning journey. And if we open ourselves up to the space of like, I'm going to be learning these new skills, I'm going to find new ways to do things. And I'm in that way, I'm in charge and I'm empowered. I think for anybody that has that sense of fear in making that change, that can be reassuring. Is that at the end of the day, you still have the agency and the control. You're just finding a different way to get it done. You've had this well-trodden way to get it done, and maybe that isn't a way that is sustainable or effective moving forward.
And my brain almost went to thinking about people in relationship. And
Mm.
it may be that we are the partner who wants our other half to do things differently. And I guess just that sense of, because it is very vulnerable to try different ways of responding that may have been years or decades
Mm.
present in your life. You can't lead you can only lead a horse to water. And I guess there has to be that real willingness to lean in and to make change and to commit to that.
Yeah.
Because sometimes for the person who might be on the receiving end of behavior that might have been described as narcissistic behavior, it may be that the outcome that's required is we need to remove ourselves from that relationship or distance ourselves from the relationship, because we can't force another person to change.
And I think where it has been useful that narcissism is more commonly discussed, online, is in some of those mechanisms and communication principles and protection kind of tasks that people have taken on. I think having better boundaries, standing up more for yourself, having more agency, looking after yourself, not stepping over red flags, as it were, is a good way to kind of take care of ourselves better. So I think in some ways, this being more common out there, people have now developed the fix. They've developed techniques and things to kind of look after themselves better. And particularly if you are a more compassionate, more sensitive, more dependent partner from an attachment perspective, you know, you find yourself a little bit more in that quadrant. You are a little bit, you know, less having agency and less kind of standing for yourself in relationships. So I think some of those methods can be useful even if you're not with a narcissist, you know, just actually in looking after yourself better.
I think having healthy boundaries and knowing where those are for you. You know, it doesn't mean that everyone has to have the same boundaries. There's not one right boundary. But I think really having that sense of what feels right for me. And it might be that we have different boundaries in different contexts or in different relationships or ways that we would respond differently. But as long as we've, I guess, been consciously thinking about what is right for me in this situation, that's a good thing, I think, to have that clarity. Sometimes the insight comes before the readiness to try and implement it differently, and that's okay too, even though that can be a little bit uncomfortable, that period after which we become aware that perhaps our boundaries aren't where we would want them to be, and it can feel a little bit frightening to think about, well, what if I behave differently? How will that get reacted to? I think it's still thinking about we can't move to action without kind of figuring out what actions, where is the destination? Where am I wanting to get to? And I think with that clarity, we can then start to work towards change. And I think narcissism aside completely, having a healthier sense of what boundaries are right for us is a great place to start.
And I think another myth is that if somebody is really controlling and, you know, they don't let us have agency in the relationship, that they can be a narcissistic person. That's not necessarily the case. I mean, if you get, I've had couples where I've worked with where, you know, one person is really, really controlling and it, you know, is quite insecure in their attachment, and the other person is a little bit more on the spectrum and quite avoidant and quite overwhelmed by all this stuff and, you know, doesn't like conflict, you know. So now this pattern can show up as really toxic because this person is demanding a response and demanding, like, what's wrong with you? Just answer my question. And I want to handle this argument we've just had. And the other person is, oh my gosh, they're really narcissistic. They're trying to like tell me my reality is wrong and they're trying to tell me I'm wrong. And, you know, so I think when you find yourself in these dynamics, what can you do? What are some practical things people can do when they find themselves in something they don't quite understand, that is that tendency to want to label it? What can we do instead?
Just before we get there, my thought is thinking around making sense of how we've gotten there. So sometimes in relationships, you know, making decisions, standing up for yourself, maintaining boundaries requires energy. There's a real mental load to that. It may not be something historically we found very easy or very comfortable. And initially, we may have really appreciated that our partner really stepped up and took responsibility for making decisions. And we were happy that they were carrying some of that, because actually that kept us in a space that helped us feel buoyant and helped us feel okay. It's then when those patterns become more entrenched and we maybe reach a point where we think, okay, this has now hit a threshold that isn't okay, and we maybe respond differently. Now, for the other partner, that might be like, why is this suddenly a problem? This is how we've always been. So there's something about really, and this isn't about excusing unacceptable behavior, but if we understand how we can think, where has this come from? How has this developed? How have we ended in this place? We can just have slightly more nuanced conversations and how to explain or help the other person make sense of why where we've gotten to now is no longer okay. Or maybe it's that we've done some work on ourselves and actually the situation that we had been in up till now and hadn't really addressed, we're now much clearer isn't where we want to be. So really getting a sense of where where things have developed from can then help us have more thoughtful conversations about that relational space in between. So that space
Yeah.
of, this is what I bring, this is what you bring, what's happening in the middle isn't working brilliantly for me right now, or hasn't done for a while. What could we do
Mm,
about this? And I think having conversations around behavior rather than you. So this
mm,
whole trend to being nice, well, you're a narcissist, that's the problem. That would be an incredibly difficult thing for anyone to hear, but also something that is not likely to lead to a productive or respectful conversation. It's likely to get a reaction. So you've then got in this space in between someone being defensive, whether or not they may meet the criteria for a diagnosis. You're likely to get a reaction that leads to a challenging interaction. So the
mm,
more we can make sense of how do we have respectful adult communications around what is happening between us. What are they bringing? What am I bringing? How do I label behavior? Not criticize the individual. We're not trying to, have a character assassination or
mm,
pull apart
mm,
someone's identity, but thinking about perhaps where we've changed, what doesn't work for us for us so much anymore, and locating that within behavior rather
mm.
than as a fault within the
And
individual.
being really specific. Yeah. So if we kind of
Mm-hmm.
summarize that into some steps, so it's obviously looking at the history of like,
Mm,
well, this was fine, and then there was a turning point. What happened here where suddenly
mhm,
this wasn't fine?
mhm,
Then looking at the specifics, so hey, when X happens, I feel like this, you know,
mhm,
and what I really need is that. And how can we figure this out? So it's actually, as you're saying, being really specific about the behavior or the context or what is actually happening that is no longer working. But providing that point of departure of like, look, this was fine, and then suddenly something happened where it's not fine anymore. Why
mhm,
is it not fine anymore? Because if
mm.
one person in the relationship is is quite entrenched or rigid or controlling or like certainty, and you've now changed, that's a huge trigger for them. They're going to behave quite narcissistically. I say that in air quotes
Yeah,
because
yeah.
it's what's changed, what's going on. You don't do this. You never say this. You never speak like this. That will feel like gaslighting, and so something shifted in this dynamic where they put up with something and now they're not putting up with something anymore. Or something has changed in the dynamic where, we want to make a shift in the way we relate to each other. But it's that specific calling out of the behavior is more constructive. If we
And
just
with the I
say,
feel.
yes, and I feel and I need, because
Yeah.
if we just say, you're this, you, lots of you statements, they're going to feel that criticism and contempt coming from us.
And it tends to get reciprocated, doesn't it? With a, yeah, well, you this and you.
Yeah, yeah.
I think there's also something, so all of those steps, and then being prepared that you maybe have had quite a bit of time thinking about how you're going to raise this. Maybe you've been processing it in conversations with friends or with a professional or journaling. This might be the first time this lands in your partner's lap. So they might need a little bit of extra time to not react quite as you would hope that they would react, and a bit of time for processing and doing their own thinking. So I think there's something about you kind of build yourself up, have the conversation, share some of that, then allow maybe some thinking time, whatever that
Mm.
looks like for you as two people, and then continuing the conversation, allowing the other person. I mean, I guess we often think about this as partners in a romantic sense, but it could be friendships, it could be
Could be your
family
work
relationships,
colleagues. Yeah.
work colleagues, allowing the other person to then come back with their stuff. Now, they
Mm.
may talk to or respond to what you've raised. They may have questions. They may have, yeah, well, when you do this, I feel this. And I guess
Mm.
we also have to be prepared to then receive our share of what might be experienced as challenging or difficult in the relationship. And I
Yeah.
think that's also a skill, is having healthy boundaries with that, sure, and being graceful in being able to hear, okay, perhaps they're blind to the things I find difficult, about their behavior, but maybe I'm blind to the things they find difficult in mine, and thinking about
Exactly.
how we then work on both sides.
I think another myth that I detest is that the grey rock method applies to every single narcissist we've ever known. So if we ever know somebody that there's a toxic behavior, we just basically push them away. We don't talk to them. We're in a rock. We have no emotion. We have nothing, and we just, whatever they say bounces off, and it doesn't happen. Yeah, that doesn't necessarily work if you have to work with the person day to day. You have to co-parent with them. Perhaps you've gone through a divorce, or perhaps they're a parent, perhaps they're a family member. And I see a lot of, in some cases it is healthy to say, all right, I don't want anything more to do with this person and to cut myself off. But it's not necessarily the one-stop shop for every situation. You can't necessarily grey rock everybody. And I think this approach of actually raising the said behavior, yes, it's not conflict avoidant. It takes courage to be able to talk about this stuff. But it is much more effective in the long term, because perhaps we're highlighting to the person that there's certain behaviors that aren't working. But what are your thoughts about grey rock for all narcissists? And, what do you think about that?
Well, I hadn't heard of grey rock behavior before, so I was glad when you continued talking so that I could try and work out. So is that a response to kind of stonewalling and just
kind of stonewalling? Just you have no effect, and I'm not engaging.
When you describe it like that, I almost have this image of kind of a la 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 la.
Yeah.
And I guess it's that sense of I think what you say is so true, that sometimes we can walk away from relationships that don't work with us, but that doesn't help us when that's not possible. They may be in our family, they may be in our workplace, they, like you say, co-parenting relationships. So it's how do we find mechanisms to have them? Otherwise, I guess we're being avoidant. We're putting up our own armor that is not really addressing the situation either. So I think finding ways to have more authentic conversations. Now, the one that you described with the steps, people can work up to that. There are ways, I guess, almost like a graded way of working up to, if that's something that feels intimidating or scary to the point that it becomes a barrier. It's not just about then not doing it at all. So we then want to break it down and say, okay, well, what is doable? Let's take steps. Let's move forward. And it might be first just around naming emotions. So when a behavior happens, I feel this, or kind of just helping the person or yourself to develop the language for describing and naming. And of course, some people find it very hard to say how they feel. They might have a sense that they feel something's off. This doesn't feel okay. I'm having a lot of, physiological reactions. My body's reacting, but we don't all have a language for describing that. So there might be other work that happens first. So I think if that feels really scary, that's not a reason not to. It might be that we break it down into other steps first, but moving closer towards how do we aim for more authentic conversations. That is a healthy place for a healthier place for relationships to be, especially relationships that we either can't or don't want to walk away from.
Definitely. Okay, well, I think that's a good sort of episode today, just discussing all things narcissism. We discussed that next time we want to discuss psychopathy. So we're going to look at all the dark triad of Machiavellianism and psychopathy, but and just looking at some of the myths that are out there about psychopathy, which is also a very rare occurrence, but some people can occur psychopathic. So we're going to be looking at, what happens in the dynamics in that relational space where that might be showing up. Fantastic. All right. So till next time, when we will continue musing things, all things health, trauma, and relationships. Take care. Bye.
Bye.
The information shared on the Naked Insights podcast is for educational and information purposes only, and is not intended as a substitute for professional therapy or counseling. While we aim to provide helpful and accurate insights, individual experiences may vary. If you're experiencing trauma, mental health issues, or distress, please seek guidance from a qualified professional. The views expressed by us as the hosts are our own and do not necessarily reflect the opinions or positions of any affiliated organizations.